Hello, I hope y'all are doing well. All right, so this is going to be over the chapter over language. So, as I've said, I need y'all's patience since I know I say it every class, but there are different chapter numbers and I'm not going to record twice. So, chapter 7, communicating verbally, I believe for you at Front Range, it's chapter 5, same content. Okay, so verbal communication or language. Go. There we go. Okay. So verbal communication or language, that's what we're going to refer to. So something to keep in mind is I know we just finished nonverbal communication. Verbal communication is only the actual content that you say. So even the way you say it is vocalics, which is nonverbal, okay? But verbal communication is still really, really important and really significant. So words and messages create meaning, okay? Or you could put labels create meaning. So what I mean by that is, yes, labels can be restrictive. If you put a label on someone and say, you have this or you are this, that might sound really bad, and it can be bad because it can be limiting, but it can also be freeing. You hear of some people, and maybe you have experienced this or have friends who have experienced this, where they get a diagnosis and they're it's like, okay, well, I don't want that to limit you, and they're like, no, that is helpful for me. That is actually freeing because I feel validated that I wasn't, somehow crazy or making this up or whatever. So, that can be really powerful. Okay. But it can also be bad. Verbal communication is also rule guided. It's also rule guided. Okay. So regulative rules tell us who, what, when, where, to make meaning out of certain things and talk about certain things. So who, what, where, when, and how we make meaning out of certain things, or how we talk about certain things. Okay. So for example, and sometimes these are overt and sometimes they are a little bit more, like norms. So, if you are around little kids, there might be content that you don't talk about. Okay, so that would be who. Another example of what we talk about would be in a library. You might not talk about certain things and say certain things. Okay. Constitutive rules tell us how to interpret messages. A little bit. So, for example, if someone's like, all right, I'll see you later, that tells you that the conversation is over or they're trying to end it. Okay. I don't know if the lighting is weird. I don't even know if y'all look at me while I'm doing this, but sorry, I don't have anyway. So sorry if I'm like super bright or you can barely see me, but maybe you don't even look at me during these, which is fine. All right. Punctuation. Think about punctuation in grammar. Okay. So what punctuation is it is the verbal communication that indicates the beginning or an end of a conversation. Okay. So how do you know when I'm starting class? Yes, I turn the music off, but usually I'll say like, all right, how are y'all doing? Or something, right? Just like a meeting. And it, something to keep in mind is, yes, there's nonverbal factors that can play in. Also, some of you are like, well, what time is it? But y'all know that I don't always start class right on time. And, same thing for a meeting. Maybe your boss calls a meeting at 2 p.m., but y'all start at 2:15. Okay. So punctuation is the verbal communication that indicates possibly the beginning, ending, or even middle of an interaction. It punctuates the interaction. Okay. So same thing where, let's say you run into someone that you went to high school with and you are, I don't know, I guess it doesn't matter where you are. And, you're like, all right, well, it was really good to see you, right? That indicates that the conversation is pretty much over. And then we always say like, we should hang out, right? And then we never do. We should hang out. Get me. We're Facebook friends, right? We're Instagram or Snapchat, whatever. All right, denotative and connotative. Denotative and connotative. Y'all have probably heard of this. If you haven't, you are going to hear of it. It would surprise me if you haven't heard of this. But the different, I don't want to say interpretations. I'll just get into it. Denotative, think of dictionary, the dictionary definition. Denotative, dictionary definition of a term. Connotative is kind of the more abstract definition, the more personalized definition. Okay, so maybe the denotative, and I don't know, maybe I should look it up for a better lecture, but denotative, maybe the dictionary definition of a father is a male that, I don't know, I don't want to get graphic, but like a male whose sperm met with the egg, like that might be the dictionary definition for contributing to the making of a child. But connotative, I'm sure if I asked all of you, what's the definition of a father? Maybe some of you, yes, it would be the nuclear, you hear it in the movies like, oh, well, he's just a sperm donor. Again, I'm not trying to be gross, but maybe for you, or it's like, oh, someone who's supportive, someone who's strong, so denotative, and that's not to say that they can't be similar. It's not to say that they're always different, but denotative is more of the dictionary definition, whereas connotative is more of the like I said, like the abstract, kind of bringing in the feelings a little bit in that definition. Okay. All right. I know this meme is kind of outdated, but when I made it, Bay was like what everyone used. All right. Symbols are ambiguous. Okay. And I know we've talked about this before. Everything is relative, right? Like if you say to someone, they're really rich. Well, what does that mean? What is rich? Let me give you another example. If someone asks you how you did on a test, and you say, oh, pretty good. What does pretty good mean? It depends on what that means for you, right? If you are an all A student and you are aiming for an A, pretty good might be an A minus. It might be like a decent A, but not as high as it could have been. If you're me struggling in math and it's pretty good, that's like a C. It's like pass. Actually, a passing grade would be awesome for me. Okay. Same thing. Let me give you another example. Let's say your friend tells you that they have a coworker that they think drinks too much. How do you define too much? Maybe it is the amount of times that they drink. Maybe it's the amount of drinks that they have in a week or in a day. Maybe if you don't drink at all and you're not a fan of drinking or whether it's for personal reasons, whether it is for religious reasons, whether it, whatever, there's addiction there. Too much might be ever. Okay. So symbols are ambiguous. There's a little bit of subjectivity to how we define that term. It depends on how we define it, right? And then symbols are arbitrary. Symbols are arbitrary. So what that one means is we've come up with new symbols and we can come up with more. Okay. So this is an outdated example, but the term bootylicious really is in the dictionary. I think recently they added YOLO to the dictionary. So symbols, yes, there are some, if you've seen My Big Fat Greek Wedding, it's always funny. He's like, oh, that comes from the Greek root word of blah, blah, blah. Yes, I get that there's, Latin or whatever. There are root words. There's meanings behind what we call things. But sometimes this is called a scarf because we call it a scarf. Like that's what, so arbitrary, again, it's just that symbols are called things because that's what we call them. But the cool thing about that is we can add new symbols. We can, yeah. All right. The significance of symbols. Okay. So symbols define. Symbols define. So something to keep in mind is when I don't know if I said this in the last slide, but when we're talking about symbols, I'm using that synonymous with like verbal communication or labels or words, okay? So symbols define. Totalizing is where you use one word to define an entire person, negating everything else about them that makes them who they are, You use one word to define an entire person, negating everything about them that makes them who they are. Okay? So, and we do this a lot. With this one, intent does play in. Okay? Intent does play in. But we do this, I don't want to say a lot, but kind of, I mean, and we do it a lot with, okay, so for example, with maybe like criminals, we might say, well, they're a criminal. Okay, but they also have other qualities about them that make them who they are. That doesn't mean anything. Taylor and I are watching, if I use this in the future, this will be a dated reference, but I don't care. Taylor and I are watching on Netflix in the evenings, The Tiger King. Y'all should check it out. It's crazy. It's like a train wreck. You can't look away, but it's insane. And literally I thought of y'all, or I thought of this because they use totalizing language. One of the guys, this won't be a spoiler, was like, oh, I was a criminal, you know, and so they said, like, I wouldn't be good raising animals. That has nothing to do with itself. Yeah, if you, like, okay, maybe if you were like Michael Vick, then there might be a little worry about you raising animals, but just because you're a criminal, that doesn't mean that you aren't capable or even have the wherewithal, the heart, the feelings to raise animals and to treat animals well. Okay? Symbols evaluate. Symbols evaluate. So loaded language is where you use specific terms to describe something that are impacted by the way that you feel about them. And then thus it impacts the ways that other people see them. Okay? So I'll repeat that. You use specific language, aka words, right, to describe something that is impacted by how you feel about that. And thus that impacts other people's perception of that. Okay? So let me give you two examples as usual. So let's say you and your friend are going to meet your other friend's new significant other. Okay. You haven't met them yet. Your friend already met them. And you're like, well, how were they? And your friend is like, they were obnoxious. Obnoxious. You're like, oh, dang. Well, okay. That sucks. I guess we'll see how this goes. And then you meet them. And then the next day you catch up with your friend and they're like, what'd you think? And you're like, they were just really full of life. What would you rather be called? Obnoxious or full of life? Right? And that, I mean, yes, I'm not saying that's a perfect synonym, but like essentially they could be the same thing, but they are very much, those two terms are very much swayed with how we feel about it, right? If you think someone is annoying, obnoxious has a negative connotation. That's not a compliment to call someone obnoxious. So again, the way that we feel about things manifests in the way that we talk about them. Okay, so that's loaded language. Our perception of what we feel about stuff, let me get a better angle. I don't know why it matters what I look. Y'all listen, we're all just, I don't know. Sorry. So the way that we feel about stuff plays into the way that we talk about it. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to stop here and then I'm going to pick up part 2 with this. So pause.